Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon to everyone who's joining today. My name is Michelle Farrell. I work with the EDGE team here at IFC in Washington, DC. And today we're going to discuss the important topic of zero carbon and why it's extremely important to address this challenge today. We are lucky enough to be joined by four very important speakers who will lead us through this topic from conception to concrete action plans for certifying a zero carbon portfolio. First, we will be going through an opening address from Zoe Norgate from Bays, who I will introduce in a little bit more detail in a minute. Also, we're going to answer the questions of why zero carbon now, and we are joined by Victoria Burrows of the World Green Building Council. Then Angelo Tan, the lead for our Philippines EDGE program, is going to guide us through the ABCs of zero carbon certification. And then in the application of zero carbon certification, how do you actually do this inside of the EDGE app? And at the end, we will be having a question and answer session. If the chat is disabled, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions as we go along. And again, we will address them at the end of the session. The agenda will take about 1.5 hours to go through, with again, the last portion being dedicated to questions. So as we get started, let me introduce Zoe Norgate as our first speaker. Zoe is the Deputy Director leading on the International Green Finance and Capability Building in Climate Change from the UK's Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The EDGE platform is currently funded by the UK government through climate initiatives called the Market Accelerator for Green Construction Program, also known as MAGIC, which is jointly managed with IFC, which enables green construction at a scale across emerging markets. So Zoe, thank you so much for joining us, and I invite you to share your screen now.
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction, Michelle, and it's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can all hear me well. Do let me know if there's any problems.
It sounds great, Zoe. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, the UK government is supporting EDGE and IFC's work on accelerating green construction. And that's part of our objective of achieving global net zero and also of our support to partner countries around the world in achieving that net zero. We know that globally, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and it really feels like we are starting to get a taste of those at the moment with all of the floods, the droughts, the forest fires really impacting on our lives. We know that to avoid the very worst impacts, we need to reach net zero emissions by around 2050, and that all sectors of the economy are going to have to be a part of that transition. We know also that right now the building sector accounts for around 40% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, and that if we carry on with conventional building approaches, this figure is only going to continue to rise. On average, the current global building stock is expected to expand by something like 5.5 billion square meters a year. And really what we do, in the next decade will decide whether in this sector we're helping to address the challenge or we're making it worse. By 2035, nearly 60% of the global stock of buildings that will be standing in 2060, at which point we have to already be at net zero, will have been built. So right now we're continuing to lock in a future of inefficient and unsustainable building stock, and it's some things are moving in the right direction, but we really need to see that accelerate. The adoption of green construction and zero carbon methods is going to be a critical focus, I think, for developers and regulators now and increasingly so. And we think that tools like EDGE, which you're going to hear more about, the Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies certification scheme can really help with that challenge of decarbonising buildings and the construction sector. We've seen the ambition set, and I can say as the UK, we were really privileged to host almost 200 countries coming together in Glasgow last year for the COP26 Climate Summit. And they've agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets to make sure that we can keep that prospect of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees of warming alive. In Glasgow, we also saw the UK, along with other world leaders, agreeing the Breakthrough Agenda, the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which is a commitment to work together to accelerate progress of clean technologies across a number of sectors, including buildings and construction, and also making sure that they're accessible and affordable for everybody. As part of that commitment from the UK, we're also increasing our climate finance to support initiatives like EDGE and other programmes, working with our developing country partners to speed up and enable further action. It's through our climate finance, our commitment to provide 11.6 billion of climate finance, that we fund initiatives like EDGE and the Market Accelerator for Green Construction. And it's been a pleasure to work in partnership with IFC to do that and to try and boost the uptake of green construction practices and technologies around the world. And to see, you know, the wider benefits that that brings, both to building owners and occupiers, and to developers in, you know, in expanding and benefiting from that green market transition. We've seen some great progress already. So in 2021, almost $191 million of IFC and private sector financing has been leveraged by the seed funding that the UK put in to support the construction and certification of green buildings. And each dollar of funding I think we've provided, we've seen something like $26 in private sector financing going into this sector. To give an example, we've seen recently the programme has worked with Colombia and BBVA to provide 200 million for lending facilities to incentivise local banks to develop new green construction finance products. So hopefully this is helping put in place some of the, you know, the incentives and means to see things scale up quickly. The programme in Colombia is working with EDGE to EDGE Advanced certification, which is looking to achieve savings of at least 40% in efficiency in buildings. And we're also, you know, really proud to support the work that EDGE is doing to enable mass market transformation and allow countries like Colombia, which I should commend for its very ambitious 51% emission reduction target, to have some of the tools to, you know, to be able to contribute to achieving those emission reductions through the building sector. We're also really pleased to see the new developments in EDGE, for example, EDGE Zero Carbon Accreditation, which is, you know, taking us nearer to where we will need to be by the middle of the century at net zero. It's always a pleasure to join such an event. Thank you very much for allowing me to open the event, and I will pass back to Michelle to introduce today's panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe, for that wonderful introduction. And without this type of financing from the UK government, this sort of catalyzing the zero carbon strategy just would not be possible with EDGE. So again, thank you for attending today, and thank you for your contribution to the session. So I will invite Victoria Burrows, our next speaker. Let me just bring up a slide first. And Victoria, who we are very lucky to be joined by today, is the Director of Advancing Net Zero. This is a pioneering world GBC global project to accelerate total decarbonization of the built environment. So in this role, Victoria oversees and supports green building councils that are participating in the project all over the world, as well as a number of other partnerships which provide funding and support, marketing and communications, and the net zero carbon buildings commitment. So thank you so much for joining us today, Victoria, and I'll pass over the mic to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to IFC and to everyone else who I'm sharing the virtual stage with today. for inviting me to speak with you for a few minutes about what we're up to at the World Green Building Council to advance the zero carbon building agenda. I'm really sorry to have to do this, but I seem to be having trouble sharing my screen. So if someone can help me with that, I don't know why it's not allowing me, but maybe we'll get into that in a second. But maybe I'll just start by saying that my name is Victoria Burrows. I'm the Director of Advancing Net Zero at the World Green Building Council, which is our initiative for advancing climate action and net zero carbon buildings. So my speech today is about the importance of going zero carbon, but actually I think Zoe's done a fantastic job at setting the scene for us. So thank you very much to Zoe for doing that. I'll just mention a bit more about then the World Green Building Council. So we are a global network of around 70 national green building councils that are working to transform the building and construction sector all across the world to make it healthier and more sustainable. So we have about 36,000 members collectively across those 70 countries, and we're accelerating action to support the ambition of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we do this by accelerating critical systems transitions and transformations that need to take place specifically in the sectors that support the building and construction sector to achieve our goals for a sustainable built environment. And we do this through 3 strategic impact areas that are climate action, health and well-being, and resources and circularity, because we have to take a holistic approach to this problem. Zoe's shared that we've got 2 choices, right? We can either be a solutions provider to the climate crisis, or we can keep contributing. So our mission and our goals under these 3 impact areas from World GBC is firstly, in climate action, total decarbonisation of the built environment. And that means nothing less than a complete transformation in the way that we design and build and occupy and use our buildings at the end of their useful life. That's no mean feat. It's an enormous challenge, but just simply something that we have to do in order to respond to the calls for action from the IPCC. In terms of health and well-being, we want to achieve a built environment that delivers healthy, equitable, and resilient buildings, communities, and cities. And then finally, resources and circularity, which does have some connections with those other 2 areas, particularly around the embodied carbon piece, but a built environment that supports the regeneration of resources and natural systems, providing social and economic benefits through a thriving circular economy. And so the programme that I look after at the World Green Building Council on behalf of green building councils across the world is Advancing Net Zero, which is our climate action initiative, but we are committed to more sustainable buildings for everyone, everywhere across these 3 impact areas. And why is this important? Why are we all here today? And again, Zoe mentioned these figures, but I'll just remind you, because they are so significant, that 37% of global energy related emissions comes from the building and construction sector directly, and a whole bunch more indirectly. We are one of the largest contributors to emissions globally, and as we're seeing, those impacts are happening today. This is not a future problem. We're also responsible for over 1/3 of global energy demand. So that's the energy that we're using in our buildings to heat them and cool them, power and light the spaces that we spend most of our time in. And around 50% of materials consumption that go into creating buildings and infrastructure projects around the world. An enormous proportion of that also ends up in landfill. So of what we're using, we're simply not using it efficiently enough. There are 192 countries that have made nationally determined contributions, known as NDCs, as part of the COP process. And we're all looking forward to heading to Egypt for COP27 to find out how countries are going to be increasing their ambitions in their NDCs. Of those 192, 136 NDCs mention building emission reductions, which is quite a high proportion. However, many of them lack the level of ambition that we need to be seeing. So having a mention of building emission reductions is one thing, making sure we're building to the level of performance that we know is possible and that we need, is something entirely different. We know that there are 80 countries of those 192 that have adopted energy codes. And again, that's great progress, but many of them aren't as ambitious as we'd like to see and are locking in some of the challenges that Zoe alluded to. And 66% of countries, so more than 2/3 of countries, lack mandatory building codes. So we know what we need to do. We know how we need to build better and design our buildings better. But in many countries, especially where we're going to be expecting development over those next few decades, there simply isn't the level of mechanism and code compliance that we need to be seeing. And where will some of that development be happening? We have several huge problems within the building and construction sector, but there's a huge challenge in that we have to address both those existing buildings that will be standing by 2060, that will still be here, and that simply won't be fit for purpose for future climate demands and scenarios, and address the additional floor area additions that we're expecting to see. And those lighter blue circles where we're expecting to see development between sort of now 2030 up to 2060 are those countries that do not have mandatory building energy codes at the moment. And so we are locking in those challenges and those solutions, not embracing those solutions that we know exist already, meaning that in the future, very soon, they will become existing buildings that need retrofitting, which is an enormous challenge that we're facing right the way across the world. So we simply need to be asking ourselves, not only how can we build buildings that are a bit better, but how can we be ensuring that we do not build any more bad buildings? No more bad buildings, only buildings that have the best performance in terms of energy efficiency and are setting themselves up to be more resilient structures for the future. And that's where Advancing Net Zero comes in. It's a global campaign from the World Green Building Council to accelerate total sector decarbonisation by 2050. And we have 3 main targets that we work across the entire world with our green building councils to increase awareness and education of the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings, and delighted that we're going to be hearing about so many in today's session. To achieve alignment and commonality between the different approaches and certification schemes that green building councils are operating and engaging with. And finally, to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples, and I'll share some of those as I'm going through today. So we have this vision, and it is becoming less of a vision and more of an imperative for the building and construction sector, of a net zero whole life carbon future. And I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment, and also some of our target dates. But also I wanted to take a moment to just break down what we mean by whole life carbon, as I think you'll be hearing it a lot throughout the course of this session today. So whole life carbon for us includes both operational and embodied carbon. And at a World Green Building Council level, we produce things like frameworks and guidance documents and reports, vision statements and call to actions that say, you know, we need to be taking action to address emissions from operational carbon. And then we set out a framework and a series of guiding principles that green building councils and their members, businesses all over the world, and of course, policymakers can choose to implement in order to ensure that they're being implemented in the best practice way possible. So firstly, the first principle when we're talking about operational carbon is to reduce and optimize energy demand, to focus on energy efficiency. Secondly is to generate the balance from renewable energy, and that could be on-site if possible, but also procured from off-site generated sources. To compensate for any residual emissions, and that might mean that there's on-site gas or on-site diesel, something that cannot be eliminated completely, but that over time plan for deep decarbonisation. So plan to transition into maybe an all-electric space if it's an existing building, but optimize the buildings for highly efficient performance and then powering those energy needs with renewable energy. Then On the other side of the equation is embodied carbon. And this is the emissions that come from the construction phase. So the materials extraction, the transport, the construction processes, all the emissions that happen in a building before the building is even occupied. And for that, our guiding principles are to prevent embodied carbon from occurring in the first place. And maybe that's by optimizing the reuse of an existing building instead of choosing to build new. To reduce and optimize the need for creating embodied carbon as a part of the design process. So maybe that's through different construction techniques on site, or through different design techniques such as modular construction and different material selection processes for lower carbon options. And the good news is that there are lots of tools out there that can help you with that decision-making process. To plan for the future, think about how that new building will become an existing building and how it can be optimized for future adaptability and flexibility over the course of its lifetime, such as removable or movable partitions internally. And then finally, again, compensating for residual emissions. At the moment, it's not possible to build a zero carbon building without occurring any embodied carbon emissions. And so making sure that we do something about those residual emissions after we've reduced them as much as possible is a really important part of that zero equation. And so whole life carbon is bringing both of those concepts together, operational and embodied, ensuring the decisions we make to ensure a building will operate really efficiently is not negatively impacted by having to, I don't know, buy a piece of equipment from the other side of the world, which might be really efficient, but it adds to the embodied carbon in the part of that process. And equally, how do decisions around materials affect the performance of the building during its operation? So we really believe that the two things need to be considered together over the whole lifetime of that building. So in terms of our dates, we have two tracks for advancing net zero whole life carbon, and which one you are on will very much determine where you are in the world, what your baseline looks like, and what's achievable within the markets that you operate. But from a mainstream point of view, what we need to see across the whole world in every market eventually is that by 2030, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have at least 40% less embodied carbon with significant upfront carbon reduction. And then all new buildings must be net zero operational carbon. So going back to those definitions I just walked you through. And then by 2050, all new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have net zero embodied carbon, and all buildings, including existing buildings, must be net zero operational carbon. And we are aware of the implications of achieving that extremely ambitious target. There needs to be, as I say, complete changes to the way we approach design and construction projects. I mean, it has a huge implication on skills and trades, and a huge implication on supply chain. And for that reason, the World Green Building Council launched a leadership track known as the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment. And through this initiative, we have businesses and cities and states and regions who are committed to taking accelerated action towards those 2050 goals. So by 2030, achieving reducing energy consumption and eliminating emissions from energy consumption within existing buildings. And then for new developments and major renovations to achieve those maximum reductions in embodied carbon and then compensate for any residual emissions. So reaching net zero whole life carbon by 2030, so 20 years ahead of our target date. And then additionally, in addition to those own projects, their own portfolios that they'd be applying that criteria to advocate through business activities for all buildings to be net zero whole life carbon by 2050. So if you're an engineer or an architect, how do you apply these principles to the projects that you're designing in order to increase that impact? So our green building councils across the world take that framework, those definitions, those dates, those principles, and then draw that down and apply it in a way that's appropriate within their particular markets. I mean, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I simply don't have time to go through all of the brilliant work that green building councils have been doing over the past 6 or 7 years that this program has been active. but there's activities across every single one of our regional networks through the Americas and Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East and North Africa as well. And you can find all of this information on our website. If, depending on where you're joining us from today, I really encourage you to reach out to your local Green Building Council and find out what they're doing to advance the net zero carbon agenda. Several of them work directly with IFC and offer EDGE certification as one of their pathways for advancing net zero within their markets. So I do encourage you to reach out to them and find out how you can get involved in what they're working on. And the net zero carbon buildings commitment, if you're interested to sign up to that for your own portfolio, again, taking that as accelerated action by 2030. We currently have 136 businesses and organizations, and several more about to be announced, who have signed up to this 2030 target for their own buildings and portfolios. And you're welcome to join, whether you have 1 building or 4,000 buildings, and work on that decarbonisation roadmap to get those buildings to net zero by 2030. And the crucial part here is that the difference in timelines between 2030 and 2050 is that the businesses and organizations and policymakers who are signatories to the commitment, the actions they're taking now to achieve their 2030 goals are helping to stimulate the innovative approaches and solutions and new business models that are necessary for the entire sector to reach 2050 goals. This is really important to accelerating that progress. And here's an example of one of our commitment signatories. This is Africa Logistics Properties, who are a member of Kenya Green Building Society. And this is an example of one of their buildings that they've certified. They've achieved EDGE certification on the 1st of September 2018. And we use rating tools within the commitment to demonstrate enhanced energy efficiency performance in pursuit of a net zero agenda. So in this case, this building's achieved a 41% reduction in energy consumption, which is fantastic. And so they're using the EDGE certification tools, and many certification schemes are available to kind of demonstrate your improvement against the local benchmarks and compliance with code, and demonstrate enhanced energy performance on that route to net zero as well. And this is really important because we cannot achieve the enormous transition that I'm talking about overnight. It's not a case of just flicking a switch. You know, it's important that we are activating solutions across the entire supply chain. We cannot wait for regulation because governments need to see the front runner action from businesses to create confidence that the businesses could deliver on enhanced regulation. So front runner businesses need to set signals through initiatives like the commitment and demonstrate what's possible. You know, put themselves out there and say, we're going to do this because we need to. And then that creates the confidence in policymakers to ratchet up ambitions, maybe through a framework to start with or a roadmap, and eventually build that into policy as more and more investors start investing in solutions for the net zero transition, and it becomes a more comfortable part of the process and less of a giant leap. And it has to be that kind of process. We call that the ambition loop. So they're kind of mutually reinforcing actions from all of the key stakeholders across the value chain. It's not the result of business action alone. It's not the result of the engineers or the architects alone. Everybody has to be moving in the same direction together. Otherwise, we simply won't make the dent that we need to be. And we celebrate progress towards these goals in our status report, the Advancing Net Zero Status Report, which gets released every year. And we just released our latest report for this year in July. And it's packed full of stories celebrating the progress that's being made from businesses and organizations in the commitment, from significant supply chain actors and from policymakers. And I'll cover some of those in a second. But the report's full of information if you're interested in how to take those steps in advancing net zero. And one of the things that we included in the report was this ecosystem map for climate initiatives. We are aware that there's lots of different things out there. There's, of course, the Race to Zero linked with the COP process and the high-level climate champions. And we've created this roadmap, this ecosystem map for you to walk through and determine which of those initiatives are the most appropriate to you, which guidance, what guidance is available out there, which organizations you should speak to. And maybe I can drop a link to the status report in the chat box if the hosts don't mind. And hopefully that helps you along your net zero journey, no matter where you are at the moment. And also in the report, I wanted to also include a refurbishment project in this presentation today. This is One Triton Square from London in the UK, and it's a refurbishment project. So it's achieved a 43% cost saving compared to a typical commercial building, carbon reduction saving, excuse me, compared to a typical commercial building, with around 40,000 tons of carbon saved. And part of that was a really innovative approach to the facade design of kind of removing, refurnishing, sort of cleaning up and improving, and then reinstalling some of the facade panels, which is a really fantastic project. As an example of what can be achieved if you have many organizations working, or many, I should say, actors in the project working towards the same goals. There are 3 organizations involved in this project who are signatories to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment. So they're all dedicated to advancing their goals through their projects, and it resulted in this project, in this outcome. And something else that we're recognizing is the recognition that we need to look beyond the business case to fully appreciate why we need to be taking action here. So we released a report last year called Beyond the Business Case, which intended to focus entirely on the social value case, but actually we found through the research of the report that the business case is strengthening. There is finance available, and it's no longer becoming more expensive to implement some of these solutions. And so we broaden out the business case into 7 ways to identify value from a more sustainable built environment, and challenge the market why you can't afford not to invest in sustainable buildings. Because if you bring other things into the equation beyond just the dollars and cents, like occupant benefits and life cycle costs through the supply chain, risk mitigation, particularly legislative, reputational, asset values and how performance links to the value of your assets, investments in terms of returning on investment, particularly with energy efficiency measures and improving your ESG performance, the access that you can unlock to finance for green buildings through embracing more higher performance building approaches, and then finally the wider role of business in environmental, social, and considering more broader corporate sustainability and social responsibility goals. Then suddenly all of these things start stacking up. And we're actually finding in different countries around the world, in particular in Australia, that we're flipping the conversation to say it's not just about how can we improve this building, it's about why have you decided not to build this building as a net zero building, and working back from that. And it's an extremely powerful and important question, and I encourage you to ask it on every project you work on from now on. And so here's a few examples of the projects that World Green Building Council have been working on recently, and reports that we've been putting out. Firstly, in the top right-hand corner there is Beyond Buildings, which is calling for an integrated approach to buildings and infrastructure. So making sure that buildings aren't just seen as individual assets, but everything that connects them together as well. The Beyond the Business Case report I've mentioned, our annual report celebrating everything that our Green Building Councils get up to in the course of a year. We've just published an EU policy whole life carbon roadmap, setting out exactly what the European Commission and EU nations need to do in terms of implementing policy on whole life carbon. We have also just published a draft, we released a draft version of an African manifesto for sustainable cities and built environment for consultation. That consultation period is now closed, but if you're interested in that piece of work, then please do check out our website. We're just consolidating all the feedback that we received, and we'll be releasing it, launching it officially at the end of September. And then we also do a commitment roundup of news stories of progress that commitment signatories are already making towards their targets. So please do keep an eye out for those as well. And within Europe, we have a project called Building Life, where we have 10 green building councils creating national whole life carbon roadmaps, demonstrating exactly what needs to happen at a national level. So taking that global framework and principles and applying how does it need to be applied at a national level in different markets. And these roadmaps that are being created are slightly different in terms of what they're calling for, but in terms of specific policy recommendations, but they're all working towards the same thing. And that's of course because the baselines are slightly different, the context, parameters, energy transition implications are slightly different in different markets. And of course, buildings are different between countries to countries next door to each other in Europe. The built environment looks very different. So there's some really different parameters to work to there. And one project that we're currently in the middle of is a sustainable, attainable housing report from our program on health and well-being called Better Places for People. And we had a call for case studies, which just recently closed in August, but please do reach out if this is the first you're hearing of it. And this is a report that's due to be published in Q1 2023, looking to profile opportunities and challenges within different regions and using those case studies, but looking to really catalyze the development of high quality, sustainable and attainable housing that can address our current global housing crisis. And then just as the very last couple of slides, I wanted to kind of talk through the process of getting to zero, where we're at now and where we need to be. And it kind of forms the theory of change of advancing net zero. And I hope makes a bit of sense of everything that I've just shared with you, why we are doing all the reports and outputs that we are, and why it's necessary to sort of work through this transition. And as Zoe has mentioned, we had a huge challenge in front of us to really shift the dial in terms of how we perform as a sector and the choices that we are making in terms of achieving those performance goals. So if we think about a chart like this, which shows number of buildings on the left-hand side and then performance on the right, we then have our level of code compliance, which of course varies country to country and even sometimes city to city within the same country and even within the same state sometimes. So we have code compliance, and the majority of buildings are still being built to code compliance. And if you remember from the very beginning of my presentation, I said that the codes are simply not up to scratch in terms of the level of ambition we need to see in performance terms for those buildings. So what we're seeing is this kind of curve, not quite a bell curve, but a sort of humpy curve, which demonstrates the number of buildings and where they are in terms of that performance scale and that kind of spectrum of net zero. And yes, there are in that bottom left corner some buildings that are under code compliance that do not meet code compliant criteria or maybe being built in countries that do not have codes at the moment. The majority of buildings will be energy and maybe even resource efficient, and the level of performance, there'll be less buildings the higher the level of performance, but that's where the majority of buildings sit. By the way, this is not based on any specific data points, so not entirely accurate to the number of buildings, but it's illustrative to show you that the majority of buildings will sit in this chunk of the chart. And then we have the next level of performance, which is net zero carbon. And actually some buildings will be net zero carbon by virtue of the grid that where they're positioned within the world. Maybe the grid is low carbon already, in addition to some of the energy efficiency measures, hopefully. And so that means that maybe they generate some energy on site or they receive entirely renewable energy from the grid. Net zero energy is another level of performance because it requires all energy to be generated on site, meaning the energy efficiency requirements need to be very, very high, and you can only consume what's generated within your energy budget on the project. And then right at the top, we have in pink what we call our unicorns, our zero carbon buildings that are built with no emissions whatsoever, that don't need to have any emissions that need to be offset, and are performing on a zero carbon basis. And that's the real pointy end of this chart, the lowest number of buildings that we have. And depending on where you are in the world, depending on what's available to you within your market, I encourage you all to at least be within this net zero ready bucket. So looking at how a building can be optimized for performance and be optimized for a net zero transition. So maybe that means all electric, highly energy efficient. Maybe it means installing the infrastructure or a roof structure necessary for a future installation of solar panels if they're too expensive to install today. But think about how to get your buildings net zero ready, even if those higher performance levels are not yet achievable. And then, of course, we need to be shifting the entire curve as we're building more buildings up to this higher performance end of our spectrum. The good news is that there are signals of change. And again, Zoe alluded to this earlier. So from a supply side, we have green building councils and other organizations across the world who are helping equip the delivery side of this problem through skills and training and increasing awareness and knowledge. And then through the demand side, we have both public and private signals from public and private developers stating that they will only achieve certain levels of performance, and in some cases already achieving extremely high levels of performance, such as the announcement from GPT last week about delivering the first upfront embodied carbon neutral development in Australia. So these are things that are already happening and pushing the dial a little bit further. And then in terms of policy, we are seeing cities sign up to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Accelerator from C40 and implementing policy requiring high performance of buildings. Denmark has published or is phasing in requirements for embodied carbon targets for buildings within policy. And so that creates, again, that demand side driver from the people who own or set the policies for those buildings. And then also finance. So I won't go through all of the examples that we have, but there's a huge amount of finance available, especially linked to performance of green buildings and high performance of green buildings, of course, you'll all know. And just one example here from recently from Actors securing $1.2 billion of impact-linked financing for their latest energy fund. And that, going back to what I was mentioning earlier, is demonstrating the ambition loop in progress. So companies or policymakers who say, you know, we will only build to this certain type of performance needs then the sector to mobilize in order to deliver that. And the finance is there if you can connect it to the performance of the outcomes of those buildings. And I just wanted to leave with a final note. We are on the road to COP27. World Green Building Council is part of the Building to COP27 coalition that is supporting the Egyptian COP presidency and the high-level climate champions on positioning the built environment at COP as a solutions provider for both mitigation and resilience and adaptation. And our next forum, which provides all the updates on how the built environment is being featured at COP, will be held next Wednesday, the 14th of September, between 2 to 3, that's UK time. And we will be welcoming Nigel Topping, the high-level climate champion for COP26, to tell us why he hopes the built environment will have its moment again at COP27. And so if you will be in Sharm el-Sheikh, I look forward to seeing you there, and do let me know. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. That was a very insightful session. And I think without the work of the World Green Building Council, these movements toward net zero energy would just not be possible. So thank you so much for your insights today. So next, we're going to address the question of how we do this. And what are the actual steps if we want to move to a zero carbon portfolio? So now we're going to talk to Angelo Chan. And Angelo is our lead for the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they are been working very hard on a zero carbon transition. And they have the most certified zero carbon buildings with EDGE out of the entire world. So Angelo, I welcome you to turn on your screen and invite you to start your presentation.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Let me load my slides. And while I'm doing that, so as Michelle mentioned, I'm the country lead for the EDGE Green Buildings program in the Philippines. The last time I counted, there are around 12 EDGE zero carbon buildings in the world, and 8 of those are in the Philippines. And we're working on the 9th and 10th up to December of this year. I'm as you can see, I'm based in Manila. I support some of our work in the Pacific Islands. And I would say that from an emerging market perspective, there are two main barriers to the uptake of net zero buildings. Number one would be the perceived significantly higher cost of achieving net zero building design and construction. And then the other barrier is the lack of technical knowledge or awareness about how to achieve net zero. I would say that in the last 5 years or so, there's been a significant decrease in the cost of renewable technology. So the first barrier has been addressed for the most part. But I would say that there's still a lot of confusion about how to do net zero. So I'll be talking about the ABCs of Edge Zero Carbon. So let's say for the audience that we have today, let's say you already have the ambition to do net zero buildings. The next question is how can you actually get there? So the discussion for this segment is to focus on demystifying Edge Zero Carbon so that more people can do it. Now, just a brief background about who we are. We're called the International Finance Corporation. We're one of the 5 member organizations of the World Bank Group, and IFC is the largest development finance institution focused exclusively on the private sector. So Michelle, Irene, and I, we come from a group at IFC called the Climate Business Department, or CBD, where we develop the tools and provide the advisory to ensure that capital goes into more climate-smart investments. And considering the topic today, what we do is to try to provide the expertise so that we can bring in more of this capital towards net zero buildings. So in that sense, we work across the real estate ecosystem. We can provide investment and advisory directly to banks and other financial institutions. So that's the yellow part. We can also directly provide investment and advisory for real estate developers and building professionals. So that's the orange portion. The green part talks about how we work on green building codes and incentives alongside the public sector. And then the blue part talks about EDGE as a green building rating system. And again, we're very grateful to the support of the UK government. Because of that, we're able to offer all of this advisory support for free under the EDGE Green Building Market Transformation Program. Now, to give you a quick overview of EDGE, and later on, I know Irene will go into more detail about this. There are 3 components to EDGE that make it quite a unique green building rating system. Number one, we offer a free software. So we call it the EDGE app, and we call it an app, but really it's a website that allows you to identify the most cost-effective measures to build green. Number two, it's an achievable standard. It's quite straightforward in the sense that we focus on energy, water, and materials, the 3 categories of resource consumption that we consider as the most climate intensive. And for you to achieve EDGE for your project, you need to reach at least 20% efficiency across all 3 impact categories. And then finally, the third component, as a green building rating system, it's a label. We award a certificate so that we can help you communicate the value of your sustainability achievement to a broad range of stakeholders. Later on, we'll see how the EDGE app works, but I would just like to highlight some of the key features. You can see at the very top row there that the EDGE reports on the efficiencies across energy, water, and materials, and it's something that quantitatively reports on these impacts and can be directly translated into utility savings for building owners, occupants, home buyers, and other stakeholders. And then the second row there talks about cost implications. So you will see what are the utility cost reductions. It will also tell you what are what's the cost of implementing the sustainability measures for your projects. And then finally, what's the payback period for the sustainability measures, considering the utility cost reduction. Next, if you look at the the third and fourth rows, you will see these are the environmental impacts. So EDGE reports on the embodied energy savings in terms of megajoules per square meter, energy savings in terms of megawatt hours per year, water savings in terms of cubic meters per year, and even operational carbon dioxide savings and carbon emissions in terms of tons of carbon dioxide on an annual basis. So it's highly quantitative. It's a very intelligent tool, and later on we'll walk you through how we use it. But I would say the most important feature of EDGE that's relevant to this discussion is that it actually provides a clear line of sight toward net zero building design and construction. Projects that certify with EDGE can achieve 3 levels of certification. So the first one is level 1. It's called EDGE certified. So it's when a project achieves at least 20% efficiency across energy, water, and materials. Now, the second level is EDGE advanced. These are for projects that achieve at least 40% energy efficiency and then 20% for water and materials efficiency. Now, for those projects that have already achieved EDGE advanced, they have the opportunity to become net zero buildings through EDGE zero carbon. So achieve 40% energy efficiency and then implement renewable energy or purchase carbon offsets for the surplus. Now, I'm sure you were able to get an appreciation of what net zero buildings are based from Victoria's presentation. On the IFC side, we consider net zero buildings as buildings that are, number 1, they're highly energy efficient, and then number 2, they're fully powered through renewable energy offsets or a combination of both. And the reason why we have these 2 components is because we don't want just any energy guzzling building to claim that they're net zero just because they have renewable energy or they have the money to pay for offsets. We believe that at the building level, building owners, managers need to make sure that the building is highly energy efficient. At the heart of this climate conundrum that we have is overconsumption, whether intended or not. And we believe that we need to do something about that first before we go on to renewable energy and our carbon offsets. So based from this definition, I present to you the ABCs of EDGE zero carbon, which is something that we developed as a simple mnemonic to guide you through the net zero building certification process. So A stands for EDGE advanced. So it's where projects need to be at least 40% energy efficient compared to baseline. Now, if a project does not meet the required 40% energy efficiency, they need to do B, building retrofits. It's where you use the EDGE app to identify and implement the most cost-effective retrofit measures to achieve the required 40% energy efficiency. And then finally, once you've achieved that level of energy efficiency, you can do C, which is carbon offsets and renewables or both. So we need to ensure that buildings are fully powered by on-site renewable energy, or they need to be purchasing off-site renewable energy through the grid, for example, or they need to be purchasing offsets for their energy consumption. Now, for each of these components, we have a lot of great case studies of EDGE zero carbon buildings here in the Philippines, and we're going to try and support this discussion with some of these great case studies that we have. So first, let's go to EDGE advanced. So it's when a project needs to reach at least 40% energy efficiency compared to baseline. So earlier, I mentioned that all EDGE projects need to meet at least 20% efficiency across energy, water, and materials. And what we mean by that is that your project is being compared to a baseline building within the location of your project of a similar typology. So that's really what you can claim when you successfully certify your EDGE, your project with EDGE. You can say that our project is at least 20% more efficient than baseline. Now, in the case of projects that are aspiring to get to EDGE zero carbon, you need to get at least 40% energy efficiency. This example is called Arthalan Century Pacific Tower, or ACPT. So it's the first EDGE zero carbon building in the world, and it's located here in Metro Manila. Through their green building certification and their sustainability aspirations, Arthalan, the developer of this building, also became the first non-bank issuer of green bonds in the Philippines. And we have a lot of resources on how EDGE can simplify the green bond issuance process. If you're curious about that, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to walk you through a green bond issuance through EDGE. Now, in the case of ACPT, on the get-go, they were able to achieve 45% even during the design of the project. And they were able to achieve this through a combination of so many different energy efficient measures. So some examples of those are a high thermal performance glass, occupancy sensors and photoelectric sensors, reflective paint for the roof, an efficient air conditioning system, and other energy efficiency measures to get to 40%. So the only thing that was left after they achieved 40% energy efficiency was to ensure that they're fully powered by renewable energy. Now, there are many cases where a project does not have renewable energy for 100% of its energy consumption. But there's also this example in the Philippines called Imperial Homes Corporation that has solar rooftop. And because of this measure, and if you actually try to model a project with solar within the Edge app, you will realize that it actually increases the energy efficiency significantly. When a project reaches the level of 40% energy efficiency, or what we call Edge Advanced, it's what we call Edge Zero Carbon Ready, or a net zero ready development. So at that point, all they have to do is make sure that 100% of the demand is through renewable or offsets, and then they just need to go through the certification process. So I think this is a very good first step towards getting to net zero developments. But I think an important message to send here is that you don't need to do solar panels to get to a high level of energy efficiency. The beauty of Edge is that it allows you a lot of flexibility in terms of the required percent of energy efficiency. And later on, when Irene presents, you will appreciate what some of those other measures are. Now, moving on, let's say your project does not meet the required 40% energy efficiency. What do you do in that case? So we encourage you to explore building retrofits for your project. A very recent success story in the Philippines is the NEO office portfolio. So this is a set of 7 office towers here in the Philippines, total area of 290,000 square meters. Some of these buildings are actually 12 years already. So a lot of them are quite old, but they have been operating with renewable energy through purchase of off-site renewable energy for a very long time. And so, during the COVID pandemic, vacancy rates for office towers were at an all-time high. And so NEO, used that time to really reevaluate how they are performing in the market and see what they can offer in terms of improving their value proposition for their tenants. And so when we engaged with them, that was really the question: how do we retrofit our buildings to become Edge Zero Carbon buildings? So when you engage with us, you will realize that we'll provide you with all of the technical support that you will need throughout the whole certification process. What we did with NEO was we helped them to do an initial assessment of their project based on as-built plans and how the buildings were constructed. And then from that, we looked at possible retrofits to get them to 40%. Now, at the end of that process, we asked them, can you give us a commitment to implement these retrofits within a 3-year period? And then those retrofit measures included occupancy sensors, light switches, and other very minimally disruptive retrofit measures to get to 40%. So they said, yes, we're willing to commit. We have that ambition. We'll provide you with that signed letter saying that we'll implement the retrofits within 3 years. And that allowed us to award to them a preliminary Edge Zero Carbon certification, making the whole portfolio Edge Zero Carbon preliminary certified. But one thing to note here is that they weren't very far from the 40% requirement. They were at around 35 to 38%. And so they didn't really have a lot of difficulty looking for some retrofit studies for the buildings. And again, we were there with them to support them on the process. And also one thing to note about these projects is that these are all buildings that are more than 5 years in operations already. And I think those that allowed them to get a very high materials efficiency because it's considered as a retrofit project. And I think this thread goes back to what Victoria mentioned earlier about embodied carbon. when we look at materials efficiency under EDGE, that's really where we target that metric. For a lot of the emerging market economies like the Philippines, the built environment grew at a significantly faster rate before any real appreciation of green buildings happened. And so we had all of these buildings that aged first. And in those cases, we actually encourage you to retrofit first, adaptive reuse, find ways to reuse the existing structure of the building and adapt it to a more current use based on market demand. And really, there's this architect that said, I think it was Carl Elefante that said, the most sustainable building is one that already exists. So especially for CBDs like like Metro Manila here in the Philippines, you have a lot of these older buildings, and we encourage you to reach out to us, and then we can help you to look at possible retrofits to get your building to net zero. And then finally, once you reach the required 40% energy efficiency through just the way you design your building, or even through a commitment to retrofit the building, we want you to look at carbon offsets and renewables. I would say that this is the most important part. A great case study for that is Menarco Tower, which is currently undergoing EDGE Zero Carbon audit here in the Philippines. When we first engaged with Menarco, it wasn't very hard to convince them to get to net zero. At that point, when we first talked to them, I think it was in February of last year, they were considered the healthiest building in Southeast Asia, being the first LEED and WELL Gold certified building in the region. But I really believe that the key decision makers in that company had higher levels of ambition, and so they asked us, what do we need to do to get there? And in July 22, as you can see from this news article, they successfully switched to renewable energy through FirstGen, which is a renewable energy provider here in the Philippines. But you don't, there are a lot of countries where you don't have such an infrastructure, in which case we encourage you to also look at on-site renewable energy. For example, if you have a big rooftop space, maybe you can consider doing solar panels, or in some areas where it makes sense, you can do geothermal on-site. But also you can buy carbon offsets, and pretty much anywhere in the world you can buy offsets nowadays. The costs for these carbon credits have significantly gone down. They're like, if you look at the UNFCCC website, for example, they have a platform, and you can see some offset costs that are around just $3 and up to maybe $15 per ton of carbon dioxide of emissions. And you have a lot more options. And again, we can guide you throughout that whole process. As you can see on the lower right part of the screen, you have a lot more options in terms of considering offsets, for example. So what does it look like when you undergo the EDGE Zero Carbon audit? We're going to ask you to submit to us your energy bills and meter readings for a 1-year period. So the building has to be operational for at least a year, with at least 75% energy occupancy for the building. So we'll look at whether you have how much of your energy demand comes from fossil fuel, or whether you have on-site electricity produced or off-site electricity purchased. And then again, we'll look at the different the energy mix for your energy consumption. That's part of the EDGE Zero Carbon process. So those are the ABCs of EDGE Zero Carbon. And wherever you are on your net zero journey, whether you have buildings that are already EDGE Zero Carbon ready, like Imperial Homes Corporation here, or if you have a portfolio of older buildings and you have the commitment to actually retrofit them to become more highly energy efficient, or even if you're like Menarco Tower, where you have a highly energy efficient building and you're considering switching to renewable energy, or if you are like Arthalan Century Pacific Tower, where you want to be the pioneer EDGE Zero Carbon project in your country, please reach out to us and let us help you achieve your decarbonization journey. There's a version of me in almost all of the countries in the world. And what you'll find if you reach out to us is that we're very willing and happy and eager to assist you find the most cost-effective ways to get to edge zero carbon. From the time that you're pitching the idea to decision makers, or even if you're a decision maker yourself and you're already looking at some sensitivity analysis on the cost, up to the point where you actually receive your edge zero carbon certificate and you want to communicate that to your stakeholders, we'll be there with you. And so with that, I'm gonna end my presentation, turn it back to Michelle, and then I'll see you later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. That was extremely informative. And I think it really answers the question of how we can actually step ourselves into this zero carbon world. So let me just share this. And next we are going to welcome Irene Montserrat. And Irene has the great insight and is our technical lead for the EDGE program. She will be showing us, now that we know the why, the how, and the way to phase ourselves to a zero carbon future, we can actually see if we open the EDGE app and we begin to use it, how do we actually put in the data that we need to get zero carbon certification. So I would like to welcome Irene and thank you so much for your participation today. And again, any questions we will be addressing at the end and put those in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me just share my screen. Great. Okay. Hi everyone, and thank you to our panelists. This has been a very interesting seminar. I'm going to cover the technical aspects for the EDGE Zero Carbon certification and show you how this free tool that has been developed by IFC, how you can use it to calculate the operational carbon footprint of your project. So I would like to start showing you our website, edgebuildings.com. Here's where you can access all the information. You can find the details of the certifications. I know Angela already explained in detail, but you can find all the information and requirements for our certification and the zero carbon certification in particular. And also on the website, you can directly here on the EDGE app on the top right side, click on the EDGE app, and it's going to send you directly to our software, which I'm going to show you how to use in a second. So I know Angela already explained in detail the requirements for EDGE Zero Carbon certification. Just very quickly, we will need 12 months of utility information, and the building should have been operating for at least 75% occupancy. I know Angelo explained a lot of how the EDGE Advanced certification works, but this is probably the most important requirement for the EDGE Zero Carbon certification, that the project has achieved the EDGE Advanced certification at design and construction. EDGE Advanced is also equivalent to Zero Carbon Ready, the concept that Victoria already explained. So there have been, as it was explained in this presentation, Zero Carbon Ready or EDGE Advanced means that there have been already energy efficiency measures applied at conceptualization of the building and implemented at construction stage, or the building has been refurbished to significantly reduce this energy demand. As my colleague Angelo already gave really interesting examples of how these steps worked. And finally, there is the next step will be to have renewable energy either on site, be connected to the grid that fits renewable energy, or purchase carbon credits. I'm not going to go into more details because I don't want to be repetitive. I know my colleague provided a lot of information, so I'm going to go straight to our app. And I also thought it will be interesting for you to see a real project that has already achieved EDGE Advanced certification and Zero Carbon certification. So this is how our Edge app looks like. You would need to create an account. That takes a couple of minutes. The app is completely free. You are able to create as many projects and save them, and you will have access to them on your dashboard. So here on the left side, you can see all the typologies that can be modeled. You can model pretty much every typology using the Edge app. And then we have the design tab, where you will be required to input some really basic information about the building. So the app will be able to calculate all this resource usage and savings. So this particular case is a retail. It's a supermarket chain. So you select, as soon as you select the building typology and the location, Edge is already going to calculate automatically a baseline energy use. Edge will use the type of building, the size, and the climate data for that particular location to calculate the energy baseline, water and materials baseline. Then we go into where we input more details about the building, the size, the type of areas, the usage, how it operates, all this basic information that will help the app to refine or detail or customize the resource usage for your project. As I mentioned, you have the option of detailing or enter the different area types that your building has. Edge will already have some default values for projects that are just starting to conceptualize the design, and they don't have all these details, but that's a way for Edge that Edge can support your project at a very early stage. Basic building dimensions. And this is an important part that we will discussing. In Edge, you also have the option for selecting different fuel usage for different types, for different use of energy. So you have, we have the option of selecting electricity, natural gas, diesel, LPG, and this is going to help us calculate the embodied carbon. This is a design stage. So as Angelo explained, Edge Standard and Edge Advanced are working for design and post-construction stage. So these three tabs, energy, water, and materials, are the sections that are going to support the project through the design and construction stage. This is an existing project, as I mentioned, that achieved Edge Advanced certification. So they selected a series of measures to get there. The beauty of Edge is that it gives you the flexibility to select whatever measure works for your environment, for your budget, for your targets. So it's just a very easy tool where you click whatever measure just to see whatever measure you think is relevant, to see what's the impact it has on your energy, water, and energy and water consumption and materials. Like it was explained by Angelo, what we mean by materials is the energy that goes into creating that specific material. So this particular project that is in Greece, they went for some passive measures, roof insulation, efficiency of glass, insulation of walls. I am aware that the purpose of this seminar is not to talk about the design. We are going to talk about the operations in a second, but I just wanted to give you this background. They have very efficient cooling systems, and they also have efficient lighting, of course, and they have a large on-site plan that helped them reach to the ambitions that this project had. Similarly for water, that I'm not going to spend much time, but you have also an option of selecting different measures to get to your water requirements. So to achieve Edge Advanced, the requirement is to get 40% energy savings, but materials and water is at least 20% savings. I'm going to go to the relevant part of this seminar, to our operations tab. So while this loads, I just wanted to mention that what's a very interesting, what makes this project really interesting is that they have solar PV, And for additional electricity that they require, they are purchasing renewable energy. So they are not using any conventional electricity at all. This supermarket chain has certified more than 1,000 stores with us. So I think also something great about our tool and the EDGE program is that this tool can support the simplification of the process for zero carbon. So it makes it easy for large portfolio owners to certify all their assets. So we are here on the operations tab now. So we already passed the design and construction stage. The project achieved EDGE advanced certification. So now after gathering 12 months of information, they are able to apply for zero carbon. This project has already been certified with EDGE zero carbon certification. So the user can select the year that they are reporting. EDGE is going to save this information, so the client can access the information of all their years that they have been entering to see how they are progressing with their project and how the building is behaving throughout different years. So everything is saved on the same platform. You select every year and you can get the information that you input that year. Just quickly to mention, you don't have to start, you don't need to start informing in January. If you gather your 12 months information in June, you can start informing from June, but we need 12 months information. So as I mentioned, this particular project did not use any conventional electricity, so they don't have anything on this row. They have on-site renewable energy and they are purchasing renewable energy. If you see at the end of the row, we have the total carbon, calculated carbon equivalent, and it's zero because it's only using renewable energy. But if we had consumed some electricity at some point, conventional electricity, you will see how the tool calculates the carbon impact for that electricity that was used at some point. We have another box for other fuel types. So the project can also, if your project uses any fuel, fossil fuel like diesel, LPG, natural gas, or any other, you can also add other fuel source. You can inform it here. And the app is going to calculate also the impact for those fuels. At the end, I think this is great as well, because sometimes it's not very simple to just for a project that doesn't have the tools to have to calculate the total kilowatt equivalent, because we have a mix of fossil fuels and electricity types, etc. So if you want to move from kilowatt, go from kilowatt to the embedded carbon, or the carbon footprint, you will need to calculate what's the kilowatt equivalent. So the app is doing that automatically for you. As soon as you input the information in these boxes, the app is going to calculate the kilowatt equivalent for all these mixes of electricity and fossil fuels. And also the app is going to calculate the on-site carbon emissions. In this particular project, because we have only renewable energy, as I mentioned, is zero. The on-site, the project is not emitting any emissions on site. Actually, this project, because of the operation of the retail of this supermarket, they actually at some point they have a surplus of energy, so they are feeding also some energy, a little bit of energy back to the grid, and we also have the option of reporting this. And the app is going to calculate the carbon mitigation due to this energy that is fed back to the grid. So you will also have here the information about how much carbon you are mitigating if you are feeding back to the grid. Finally, also you have this row here. If the project is purchasing any carbon credits, you can inform that here. This particular project doesn't have them, but you can also inform any amount of carbon that you are purchasing from carbon credits. And the tool is going to calculate the total GHG that has been offset for these carbon credits. And finally, we will have the last row, which is the net carbon emission balance. And we want the total here at the end of the row on the right side. This total has to be equal to 0 or a minus to be able to apply for zero carbon certification. So minus emissions means that we are mitigating more than what we are using. And once this project or any project achieves the 0 or the minus, they will be able to apply for zero carbon certification. And you can do that directly from the app. I'm going to explain these boxes in a second, but once you achieve that 0 and the project has achieved EDGE Advanced, this button here, apply for zero carbon certification, will be enabled, and you can do everything from this platform. In this case, it's not enabled because I'm not the admin of this project, so I'm not able to apply. Only the creator and the admin for the project is able to apply for certifications. This is important to mention. We have this box for assumptions on the emission factors. So let's say your project is connected to a hydro plant and you have access to what's the emission of that particular project. You can also input that information. Or you have a specific information about the electricity type and the emission factor. You have the flexibility of informing all that specific section in the project. Finally, we have some graphs showing how the building is behaving. This blue line is the kilowatt per square meter, so it's informing what's the performance of the building through the year as expected, because it's in Greece. During summer they are consuming more energy. We are also showing the total GHG offsets, how it's behaving through the year. And on the right side, we have the total energy consumption, the kilowatt equivalent and the renewable energy. And I think, Michelle, that will be it from me. But thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene. Now, I just want to thank all of our speakers today, from Zoe, which spoke to us about how governments and the UK specifically is enabling this sort of environmental change and stepping towards zero carbon. And then I also want to thank Victoria, which talked about the why we're doing this, but also about the how we can step towards this. What are the initiatives that you can be part of, how you can join your local Green Building Council and get involved in this movement. And also thank you to Angela, which talked about the ABCs of zero carbon. And I want to really highlight that this is something that a lot of questions have come up about. How do we convince building owners to do it? How do we step towards that? And we'll address some of those questions in a second. And then thank you to Irene as well for the technicalities of how we do this. So, we know the why, the how we do it. How can you talk to owners of buildings about this? And then how do we actually step towards this type of future? And then once we get to the EDGE app, how do we input that information to actually apply for zero carbon certification? So